Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Ten ways to be perfect. Moses and the Ten Commandments, from Exodus 16 through 17, 19 through 40. So there they all were, grannies, granddads, babies, uncles, aunts, children, moms, and dads, out there in the middle of the desert. They had blisters from all the walking. They were hungry and thirsty and much, much too hot. We don't like it, they said. It stinks. And so did they, for that matter, because no one had taken a bath in weeks. Now remember, because this is something that they'd forgotten, God has done amazing things for his people. He'd hidden them inside a cloud, he'd moved the sea, he'd set them free. But God's people still weren't happy. They didn't care about being free. Wasn't it better when they were slaves? At least they had lots of nice food to eat. God doesn't want us to be happy, they said. It was the same lie that Adam and Eve had heard all those years before. God has brought us out here to kill us. God doesn't love us. But they didn't know God very well, did they?
Every day of their journey, God kept on showing his people how well he would look after them if they would trust him and obey him. When they were hungry, God made the sky rain with food, bread coming down from heaven. "What is it?" they asked each other. They didn't know, so they called it, "What is it?" Which, of course, is a very good name for something when you don't know what it is. When they were thirsty and started quarreling, God made water flow from a rock. Moses called that place Quarreling because that seemed like a good name too.
And still God's children didn't trust him or do what he said. They thought they could do a better job of looking after themselves and making themselves happy. But God knew there was no such thing as happiness without him. So God led them to a tall mountain. God wanted to talk to his people and show them what he was like. He wanted to help them know him better and tell them about the special land he was going to give them. "The whole earth belongs to me," God said, "but I have chosen you. You are my special family. I want you to live in a way that shows everyone else what I'm like, so they can know me too."
God called Moses up the mountain. The great mountain shook. A thick cloud fell. Thunder roared. Lightning crackled. And God gave Moses 10 rules called commandments. "I want you to love me more than anything else in all the world. And know that I love you too," God told them. That is the most important thing of all.
God gave them other rules too, like don't make yourselves pretend gods, or don't kill people, or steal, or lie. The rules showed God's people how to live and how to be close to him and how to be happy. They showed how life worked best. "God promises to always look after you," Moses said. "Will you love him and keep these rules?" "We can do it, yes, we promise," the people of Israel said. But they were wrong. They couldn't do it. No matter how hard they tried, they could never keep God's rules all the time. God knew they couldn't, and he wanted them to know it too. Only one person could keep all the rules. And many years later, God would send him to stand in their place and be perfect for them, because the rules couldn't save them. Only God.
Welcome again to our third week in our series, Long Story Short, based on the book by Josh McNall. If you haven't got a book, I think we still got a handful of copies out in the lobby area. You can pick it up. And if you've been with us the last 2 weeks, then you're probably wondering, when does the short part come in? Because we have, in 2 weeks, gone through the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And if we keep to that pace, doing a chapter and a half per week, It'll take us 15 years or more to get through the remaining 12,000 chapters in the Bible. So we're going to speed it up a lot this week, and we're going to go through the entirety of the Old Testament, from Genesis 4 to Malachi 4, right? So buckle in. We're going to move pretty fast through all this. But just a reminder, we're doing the Bible in 6 simple movements. And the first movement was about creation. The second movement was about fall, the fact that all of us fall short of God's glory. And so this week we move into God's redemption plan. How is God going to restore creation to the original purpose and beauty for which he had? And the story begins, the redemption plan begins by God choosing a partner people, the people of Israel, to covenant and be with him as his people. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably grew up knowing a lot of stories from the Old Testament, like stories from Sunday school days. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jericho and the walls come tumbling down, and David and Goliath, and Daniel in the lion's den. But you know all these individual stories, but we don't know how they all fit together. It's kind of like trying to put together a big jigsaw puzzle and not having the box to look at as a guide for how do all these individual pieces fit together. And I know for me, going to seminary was this aha, because for the first time ever, I had someone kind of explaining for me the history, the big, grand story of Israel in which I could place all those parts. And so that's what I'm hoping to do today in just, half hour is to give you this framework to understand the big picture. I won't be able to cover every story in the Old Testament. I won't be able to answer every question. And I know there are legitimate questions that all of us have about the Old Testament. But I hope to give you a framework to understand how all those stories fit together. And more importantly, how that story points forward to the story of Jesus Christ. And to show that it's not 2 separate stories, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, but they're one continuous story about a God who loves his creation and is committed to working with and redeeming creation all the way to the finish, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to cover this in a couple different chapters. We're going to focus on certain individuals, and then we're going to fast forward the story, if you will, by centuries. And so I hope, don't get whiplash as we go through this, but the story of Israel begins with God choosing a single man and a single woman with whom to begin his covenant partnership. And so we begin with Abram and Sarai, who lived 2,000 years before the time of Christ. They were as far removed from Jesus as we are today, as far as in periods of time. And Abram and Sarai's story starts with a call from God. Leave your household, leave your country, and go to the land that I will show you. Now this promise, this call comes completely out of the blue. We're not told why Abram and Sarah, why God chose them. We're simply told that they received a call, and with that call came a promise that if you go and trust in me, then I will bless you and watch over you. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And through you and your descendants, all the peoples of all the nations will be blessed. Abram and his family will be the vehicle through which God's continual blessing unfolds for all creation. The problem is, Abram and Sarai don't have children. And they're much too old at this point in their lives to have children. And so this becomes part of the crux of Israel's story of will they continue to trust in God's call and believe in God's promise, even when circumstances, seem to be the opposite. Yes, the sky will fall and sometimes the people fail, but nothing ever invalidates the call that they receive, a call to be the recipients of God's blessing and through whom God's blessing will go to the nations. It's important when we kind of think about this idea of election. And when I say election, the theology of election, I'm not talking about what we do in our country, we elect our leaders. Instead, when we talk about the election in the Old Testament, in the Bible, we're talking about the act of God choosing some. When we talk about God calling, God choosing, why is it that God calls and chooses some and not others? And sometimes this gets very confusing, but I like how Josh McNall put it. He says, what Israel's calling reveals about God's choice is crucial. Divine election is not primarily about God choosing one person instead of others. Rather, it's about God choosing one for the sake of others. The point here is redemptive. The idea is that through God's choice of Israel, all nations, races, tribes, and tongues will have access to salvation. Indeed, creation itself will be restored. This is the end goal of election. God chooses a part for the good of the whole. As he says to Abram, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So whenever we start talking about the idea of God choosing, God calling, which is kind of woven into our Christian understanding that God has chosen and called us, we always have to remember we are called and chosen for a purpose. That God's salvation may extend to all peoples, to all places on the earth. And we are part of God's unfolding plan. And so Abram and Sarah, who eventually become Abraham and Sarah, they have a child named Isaac. And Isaac has two children, Esau and Jacob. We're going to continue the story through Jacob's line. Jacob has 12 sons who eventually come to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of those tribes, one of those sons is named Joseph, who his brothers sell into slavery. He has to work his way up in the nation of Egypt. But this is all part of God's redemptive plan again, because he becomes the redemptive savior for his family who can provide for them in a time of famine. And so Jacob moves his whole family down. Joseph helps provide for them, and they don't return back to Canaan, to the land where they're from, but they settle there in Egypt, and their children have children, and their children have children, and their children have children. And now we're going to fast forward 4 more centuries to the next chapter in the story. And when we reach this next chapter in the story, something has gone horribly wrong, because the children of Jacob are no longer free in the land of Egypt. Instead, they have been enslaved, forced to work without recompense, and their lives are bitter and hard because of their Egyptian taskmasters. And they cry out to God for help, and God sends again a servant in order to redeem them, a man named Moses. Now, Moses is sent, and so this is chapter 2 in the story. The first chapter is about the call that God gives Abram. Chapter 2 is about the covenant. Because Moses comes and he, with God's help, liberates the people of Israel from Egypt with 10 epic plagues that come upon Egypt. The last, of course, which is the worst, the death of the firstborn son. Finally, Pharaoh relents, but no sooner does he relent than he changes his mind, and the people have to narrowly escape through the Red Sea. But then the people find themselves out in the desert and the wilderness, and they are God's chosen people who have been liberated from Egypt, but they don't yet know how to live into this call that God has given them. They don't know how to live as God's partner people, as God's chosen people. And so God gives them a covenant so that they can know how they are to live as his people. We call this covenant the 10 Commandments. Now, we often make the mistake of thinking the 10 Commandments are rules, a list of thou shalt and thou shalt nots. But covenants weren't just about rules. Covenants were about promises. They're about relationship. It's like when a man and woman stand at the front of the church and they make a covenant with one another. Those vows that they make, they're not just rules about they shall and they shall not. It's a commitment, a mutual commitment that they make, that they spend the rest of their lives living into. And so when God gives the covenant to the people of Israel, he begins by reminding them of who he is. He says, I am the Lord your God. I am the one who brought you out of slavery, out of the land of Egypt. He wants them to know who he is, and then the rest of it comes as a response to his act of salvation. Josh McDonald puts it this way. He says, based on that act of saving grace, God says to the Israelites and to us, he wants us to live a different kind of life. He wants us to live a life of love and goodness and worship, a life of honesty, not exploitation. It's not rules for the sake of rules. It's rules for the sake of right relationships. And like everything else God does through the Bible, it's about communion coming back to creation. And so chapter 2 in the story is about people learning to live in right relationship with God and with one another. It's about living into the covenant. And they spend a generation in the wilderness, in the desert, learning to live this way. And finally, they're about to enter into the promised land. And Moses can't go into the promised land, but he reminds the people before they go on without him. He says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you today. I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. And he implores them, choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, that you may cling to him, for he is the life and the length of your days. This is the relationship into which you are to live. And if you live into this relationship, blessings will follow, Moses declares. So then the people enter the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, and they slowly, one by one, capture the cities of the people who are living there. And then for the next couple centuries, we're going to fast forward again. The next couple centuries, the people live as this loose federation of tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And from time to time, God raises up judges, leaders who will kind of protect the people from threats, whether it's Gideon or Samson or Deborah. But none of them become kings or queens. They kind of serve their purpose and they recede in history. Meanwhile, the people keep crying out again and again and again to God. We need a king. We need law and order. We need to look like our neighbors. And so finally, God relents and gives them a king. And the first king they choose looks the part of a king. I mean, he's a warrior. He's strong, tall, handsome, King Saul. But mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, he's unstable. And God realizes this is not the person on whom I want to base a dynasty. And so God says to Samuel, the prophet, plan B, I want you to go choose another person. And God leads Samuel to someone who's the kind of like the anti-Saul, the opposite of him, a young shepherd boy named David. And God says, this is the one on whom I'm going to build the dynasty. Now, David wasn't perfect either. He made some grave errors and mistakes in his life, but the thing about David is he had a heart for God. He pursued God with all he did. He wrote some of those beautiful praise and poetry in the Bible, which we have in the book of Psalms. And to some degree, the fact that he was a shepherd became the defining motif of what a king was supposed to be, that the king was supposed to shepherd the flock of Israel, to protect them from external threats, and to provide kind of good grazing conditions, to lead them into green pastures and still waters. And most importantly, to shepherd the people and lead them toward God. That when the king led the people in the right direction, blessings followed. But when the king directed people and led them astray, the sheep would be scattered and disaster would follow. So God was pleased with David as king. The kingdom prospered underneath him. Jerusalem was established as the capital. The 12 tribes were united. The Ark of the Covenant is returned. And so God makes a promise to David, which we find in 2 Samuel. It says, this is what the Lord of hosts says to my servant David. I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be leader over my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I've eliminated all your enemies before you. And now I will establish a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so they can live on their own, in their own place, and not be disturbed again. Nor will malicious people oppress them anymore, as when I appointed judges over my people Israel. And so God makes a covenant. He says, so when you die, David, and your days are finished, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendants after you, who will come from you, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I'll establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. It's a beautiful and wonderful promise. And on the face of it, it looks like God's making this promise towards Solomon, because he's the one who's going to build the house, the temple of Yahweh. But the problem is not just Solomon and all the kings who follow after him. They don't shepherd the people the way David did, the way that God wanted them to. And in fact, at the end of Solomon's reign, the people's backs are broken with all of his taxes for his lavish living and his thousands of marriages and all of his foreign alliances. And so then the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Israel, splits in two. because the descendants of David are leading the people astray, and you have this split of the kingdom less than a century after David. 9 tribes move to the north. They become the nation of Israel, where Samaria is the capital. 3 tribes, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, split to the south. They become the nation Judah, where Jerusalem is the capital. And the 2 will never be combined again. So this is the narrative arc, if you will. You start with the call, and then that becomes the covenant. How do we live? And then it becomes the king, the one who's going to lead us to living into the covenant and call. But then comes collapse, because a house divided can't stand. Because the kings who follow after David, they lead the people astray again and again and again. And so fast forward 2 centuries, 722 BCE, the Assyrians come in and destroy, wipe off the face of the earth, the nation of Israel. The northern kingdom is gone. The southern kingdom just barely survives. Like Jerusalem is besieged by Assyria. They only escape because of a plague that wipes out the army. It has nothing to do with their own valor. And so they think for a while that they're safe, that God will protect Jerusalem always, but if they don't continue to seek God, that's not what's happened. So you fast forward another century, and Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians. 2 separate deportations took place, 596 and 587. And the second one is the worst of all, because with that's when the temple is destroyed and the walls are knocked down. They are left completely vulnerable, exposed, and dragged off into slavery. Again, they spend about 40, 50 years, about the same length of time as the people originally spent in the wilderness. They spend that long in exile, the Babylonian exile, until the Persian Empire and King Cyrus comes along and beats the Babylonians, and he sets the Israelites free to return home. But when the Israelites get back to their home, they discover it's not like it used to be. They're vulnerable and exposed, and they're victimized by all their neighbors. And so God raises up leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the temple and then the walls. And then there's stories, because not all the people return. A lot of the people stay, where in the countries where they've been scattered, the diaspora, they call it. And so you have stories like Daniel in the lion's den, and Esther, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these examples of faithfulness, of how you can continue to love and serve God even in a foreign country. But if you had to pick one character, like we've tried to do for each stage of Abraham, Moses, David, if you had to pick one person to represent the collapse, it'd be the prophets. And I had this huge misperception about prophets. I thought prophets were soothsayers, that they told the future, that the prophet's chief function was to predict the coming of Jesus, but not so. The prophets were messengers of God. God gave them a message to give to the people, and for the centuries leading up to the destruction, the message was a warning. Turn back to God, repent before it's too late, because destruction is coming if you keep pursuing idolatry and injustice. But the people didn't listen. But then after the fall, during the collapse, suddenly the prophet's voice, their message changes, because their message for the people is not, I told you so. Their message is, God hasn't left you yet. Collapse doesn't equal abandonment. It doesn't equal rejection. God still loves his people and has plans for them. We know the Jeremiah verse. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to give you hope and a future, for good, not for evil. And so how do the prophets communicate this back to the people? Well, they do it by bringing them back to their story, to the call, to the covenant, and to the king. The prophet Isaiah tells the people about their call. He says, it's too small a thing for you just to be restored as the tribes of Jacob, bring back the house of Israel. No, I have made you a light unto the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Don't you remember? I told your forebear Abraham, through you all nations will be blessed. You still have a call and a purpose. And then the prophet Jeremiah reminded the people of the covenant. He says, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. It won't be like the covenant I made before when I brought them out of Egypt, when my people turned away. This covenant will be different, because this covenant I will write on their minds and in their hearts, not on tablets of stone. And every person will know me, and they will not sin and turn away from me anymore. And then the prophet Ezekiel reminds people of the king, the shepherd king, and he says, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself will search for my sheep, and I will look after them. I'll gather them and rescue them from all the places where they are scattered on days of clouds and darkness. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down. I will shepherd the flock with justice. I will rule over them and make things right. My point is that the collapse was not the end. The collapse was actually the recovery, not political or economic recovery. But this was the moment when the prophets helped the people of Israel recover their identity, recover a story that they had lost. And they brought them back to their call and helped them renew their covenant and pointed forward to the coming of a king. And you put those three together, and together they point to the next chapter in the story, the coming of Christ, the one who would fulfill the call and create the new covenant and be the king, the descendant of David, whose house would stand forever. But that's next week's story. For this week, as we pause here and reflect on the story of Israel, if there's one word, one theme I want to leave you with, it's the theme of striving. It's the word strive, because that's what the word Israel means. It's to strive with God. The name comes from a story about Jacob. Jacob was a trickster, a deceiver. He cheated his brother out of his inheritance, the blessing of his father. And because his brother was bigger and stronger than him, Jacob ran away so that, his brother wouldn't kill him. And then after decades spent living with his uncle Laban and kind of conniving and cheating his way into wealth and fortune again, he knows eventually he has to come back home and face his brother again. And so the night before he's about to cross the river into his homeland to face his brother after decades apart, he sends his wives, his servants, his whole household, everyone ahead of him, and he stays behind on the other side of the river. And in that night, he has this dark night of his soul where he wrestles with God. An angel visits him, and the way the story is told, he physically wrestles with this angel. And Jacob doesn't have the power to overpower, to beat the angel, but he can hold on for all of his might, and he will not let go. He keeps holding on until finally, the angel, touches the hip and puts it out of socket. And even then, Jacob won't let go. He says, I won't let go until you bless me. And the angel says, okay, I bless you. From now on, your name will not be Jacob, trickster, deceiver, but instead Israel. For you have struggled with God and man and overcome. And this becomes the theme, not just of Jacob's story, but the theme of all those who would come after him, that they are called to wrestle with God. Josh McNall puts it this way. He says, this was the calling with which every son and daughter of Israel would have to struggle. The realization to be passed from every Hebrew mother to every child. God chose us, he spoke to us, and he expects something from us. Like Jacob by the brook, the children of Israel would wrestle with God's call upon their lives to be a different kind of family, a different kind of community, a different kind of nation, a holy people. And some would wrestle well and some would wrestle poorly, but none would escape the struggle. And even God doesn't escape the struggle. Because there are different times in the period of their history, the length of their covenant, when God struggles with Israel. Like, how does he continue to love an unfaithful people? I love how the prophet Hosea captures it in Hosea 11. He reflects and he says, when Israel's a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. I was the one who taught him to walk. I led them with cords of human kindness and bands of human love. But the more I called, the more they went away from me. And when reflecting upon how he's going to punish, how the judgment he's going to call down, even in that moment, God expresses, how can I give you up? How can I hand you over? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. God will wrestle with Israel. Israel will wrestle with God. And in that wrestling is the story of the Old Testament. If you are in a place this morning where you're wrestling with God about something, asking why, wrestling with a call, wrestling with a promise you've made that is costing too much to keep, wrestling with control and making Christ the king of your life, if you're wrestling this morning, it might be that you are doing exactly what God asks his partner people to do. Because sometimes faith isn't easy. Sometimes it can look a lot like wrestling. It can be a fight just to hold on, to find purpose in pain, to find hope and despair. And my encouragement to you this morning is if you are wrestling with God, keep wrestling. Don't give up the fight. Don't get tired and lay down, but keep holding on for all you have. Because in the wrestling, there is blessing. You know, the Apostle Paul said to the Philippians at one point, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. I used to always wrestle with that. Like, what does that mean to work out our salvation? Isn't salvation a gift? And yes, it is a gift from Jesus, but I do believe sometimes we are called to wrestle with it, to work it out with fear and trembling, all the while trusting that God is at work in us, both to will and to work for his good pleasure, to work out his great story of which we are a part. And maybe the question isn't just what you were wrestling with, but let me go one step further and say, what are we striving for? What's our story about? Are we striving towards something? Are we striving to greater faithfulness? Are we striving to be kinder to one another? Are we striving for peace in our own heart and in our world? Are we striving to forgive those who need forgiving? Are we striving to love everyone unconditionally? Because that is that's the inheritance that we receive. Because we as the people of Christ are grafted into the story of Israel. We are heirs of the promise. We are heirs of the call. Through us, we are to be a light unto the nations. And the only way that happens is if we continue to strive with God, to strive with the call, to strive with the covenant, to strive with the King, to make him the Lord of our lives, and to honor him and obey him in everything we do. So I encourage you, I call you, as Moses called his people, I call heaven and earth as witnesses. Choose life. Cling to the Lord your God, for he is your life and the length of your days. Strive with him with all the strength and with all the hope that he provides. Amen.